very good morning, afternoon, or evening to all of you, depending on where you are in the world and which time zone you are in right now. Let me just briefly introduce myself. I am Wei Meng Chan from the National University of Singapore, and I feel very privileged to be able to present to you this plenary talk today on the topic of foreign language study abroad and intercultural mediation, the construction, co-construction and reconstruction of cultural meanings. Perhaps some of you might not be too familiar with the construct of intercultural mediation. What is it and what does it do? Let's start perhaps with the dictionary meaning of the verb to mediate. You see on this slide the definitions of the verb by the Merriam-Webster Dictionary Online, and its first meaning, to mediate, is to act as an intermediary, basically to effect, communicate, or to transmit something. And the second meaning is perhaps what the layman, maybe even most of us, will associate mediation with, namely as a means to resolve conflicts and to resolve differences between two or more parties. And this is essentially how intercultural mediation, or the intercultural mediator, was construed to be in early research into intercultural language education, as we will see from the quotes on the following slides. Byrom sees intercultural speakers as individuals that, and I quote, may be called upon not only to establish a relationship between their own social identities and those of their interlocutors, but also to act as mediator between people of different origins and identities. It is this function of establishing relationship, managing dysfunctions, and mediating which distinguishes an intercultural speaker. In his view, the intercultural mediator will mediate between conflicting interpretations of phenomena and help interlocutors overcome conflicting perspectives. And he can also help the interlocutors identify common ground and unresolvable difference. This was the second dictionary meaning we had seen previously. That is, the intercultural mediator with a function of resolving conflicts and reconciling differences between cultures. Sarrat and her associates see intercultural mediation, or cultural mediation as they call it, as vital in situations where there is misunderstanding and incomprehension between people of different cultures. Its purpose is to remedy the problems and conflicts between them in the language teaching context. Both Sarrat and Byrom take an interpersonal perspective to intercultural mediation, with the mediator acting here in interaction with others and on others. The mediator could be the learner of a foreign language, or the teacher who acts to enable comprehension and understanding among his or her learners of, for example, the new language and culture being learned. It is thus not surprising that the Common European Framework of Reference, in its latest companion volume of 2018, takes a similar position, as you can see here, with the learner described as a social agent who creates bridges, and with mediation described as a process that enables communication and cooperation and diffuses potential conflicts and tensions. However, for us in education, we have an additional understanding of the concept of mediation. I believe we are all familiar with the sociocultural theory of learning, or SCT, which posits that thought and learning are mediated by social interactions as well as our own cognitive symbolic tools such as language, and consequently our own inner speech. Vygotsky, Lentov, and others see learning as taking place in the interactions between learners and more knowledgeable others. So there's mediation on the interpersonal plane that impacts learning. At the same time, mediation takes place on an intrapersonal plane, as the new experiences and meanings arising from these interactions have to be connected and interpreted by the learners themselves to construct new knowledge and to reconstruct existing knowledge. The learner acts as a mediator and mediates for himself or herself. I am a member of a research network, or REN as we call it in short, registered under ILA since 2015, working on the theme of intercultural mediation in languages and cultures education. And we are currently working on a book that is expected to appear by the end of this year. In this book, we have expanded our understanding of mediation to include the SCT-inspired view of mediation. For us, intercultural mediation encompasses processes through which learners make and interpret meanings in language and cultural contexts that are new for them, and which occur where an additional language and culture are the focus of learning. Intercultural mediation thus supports the learning of a new language and culture which are closely intertwined. In the view of Kohler, in the context of foreign language instruction, the teacher is the external mediator, the more knowledgeable other who supports the learner in constructing new knowledge and in connecting existing and new knowledge in this process. At the intrapersonal level, the learner mediates for himself or herself and navigates between his or her own language and culture and the new language and culture, and builds connections between the two systems, typically in response to new inputs and experiences from external sources and mediators. The ILA-REN thus adopts a more inclusive understanding of intercultural mediation and not a single reductive or restrictive definition of it. Each member of this network has an individual notion of this construct. That is, it is different from member to member, but we do not exclude any member's individual personal notion. Instead, we try to communicate our views to one another and try to gain an understanding of the differing views which are often embedded in our individual cultural and research traditions. And that we do in the true spirit of intercultural mediation. Shared among the ILA-REN members, however, is the centrality of meaning in our individual notions of intercultural mediation, namely that it enables the construction, co-construction, and reconstruction of cultural meanings in foreign language learning or in contact between different cultures. Let me summarize and reiterate our understanding of intercultural mediation. 1. Intercultural mediation helps learners connect and interpret new cultural meanings in constructing new cultural knowledge. 2. It thus facilitates the understanding of cultural practices and concepts. 3. It can trigger and encourage reflections and critical appraisals, that is, appraisals that are based on critical and unbiased reasoning, that can in turn lead to the reconstruction of one's attitudes and beliefs, and consequently one's identity as well. And 4, in re-establishing relationships and or resolving conflicts between parties of different cultures. It can create shared meanings or restore lost meanings that can enable understanding and dialogue among cultures. While we now know the importance of intercultural mediation in the learning of a foreign language and culture, there are still many unanswered questions that had motivated us to explore this construct more closely. For instance, which forms of intercultural mediation take place in foreign language learning and teaching situations and in cross-cultural contact and interactions? What processes and events are involved, and who are the mediators? What triggers the mediations? And what purposes do they fulfill? Or what kind of effect do they have? And perhaps, most importantly, how do they contribute to the development of intercultural competence? The study that I would like to present today is part of a larger project that I had initiated together with several colleagues of mine in Singapore. We wanted to investigate the effects of short-term study abroad on the intercultural development of foreign language students. The participants were 29 university students, learners of Chinese, French, German, Japanese, Korean, and Thai, taking part in 10 different study abroad programs in France, Germany, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and Thailand. The three main objectives of the study were: 1. To analyze and describe instances of intercultural mediation. 2. To classify them and to build a taxonomy of mediations. And 3. To investigate how these instances of mediation relate to one another and how they contribute to one's intercultural development. Besides achieving a better understanding of the construct of intercultural mediation, we believe that the findings can potentially inform the development of curricular goals, plans, and materials in intercultural foreign language learning, and they can also provide a framework for the design and conduct of research in this area. The main data for the study were collected from the 29 subjects through qualitative instruments, namely weekly journal reports and post-immersion interviews on the participants' experiences, the knowledge and insights they gained, and changes to the perspectives of the native and the target language culture. Further data were captured through field observations of the study abroad classes and activities, as well as the inspection of curricular materials and other relevant documents. The analysis focused especially on the journal reports and interview transcripts to identify and code information related to acts of intercultural mediation. The coded information was then tabulated under the rubrics events or acts, mediators, the direction of mediation, the motives behind the mediations and their effects, the data sources, and the classification of the mediations. The forms of mediation identified are then further grouped under larger headings. In addition, we also looked at and identified patterns in the distribution, concurrence, and sequence of the mediations. Here is an example of how we coded and tabulated the data according to the episodes that gave rise to the mediations. There are columns for the description of the events or acts in which the mediations took place, for recording the subjects and mediators involved, the direction of mediation, that is, for whom the mediations were carried out, observations about the purposes and effects of the mediations. The instances and the proposed classification of the mediations are recorded in the last column on the right. As you can see, an individual event or act can lead to multiple instances in classes of mediation. The classes of mediation identified through the analysis of the individual events and episodes are then further grouped under larger headings. Here, you see an excerpt from one of these larger groups. In all, we identified 9 larger groups. We see here the 6th of these 9 groups, which we gave the heading meaning making. 2 of the forms of mediation we identified in the previous table, namely connecting new cultural knowledge with existing knowledge and interpreting and making sense of new cultural knowledge, are grouped here under meaning making. Here you see another example of a table under a larger heading, namely the 3rd of the 9 groups with the heading Facilitating Language, Cultural Learning and Communication, encompassing the mediation classes, facilitating the discovery of the target culture, and translating to facilitate communication, among others. In all, 9 larger groups of mediations were identified and coded. These 9 groups were further organized according to whether they were directed at others or at oneself, that is, the subject himself or herself. Among the mediations for others that we have identified are those that involve 1. Informing others about culture. For example, when someone more knowledgeable, such as the language instructor, informs his students about the new culture. 2. Scaffolding learners' adaptation to sociocultural practices in a new culture. For example, when the host family inducts the subject into the recycling practices of a new culture. This is perhaps a form of mediation that is specific to the context of our study, as our data were collected from students on study abroad programs. 3. Facilitating language and cultural learning or communication with the target language community. For example, when a teacher conducts a treasure hunt activity for students to discover the local culture. And 4. Establishing and managing relationships between cultures. For example, when someone, it could be the teacher, a host parent, or even the learner himself or herself, intervenes in some way to ease tensions or resolve a conflict between 2 parties from different cultures. Mediations for self include 1. Knowledge uptake and acquisition, such as when a learner observes and notices a new sociocultural practice or asks someone more knowledgeable in the other culture about it. 2. Meaning making, for example, when a learner compares a practice in a new culture with his own native culture to interpret or to understand the practice and its purposes. 3. Critical appraisal, which involves making reasoned judgments of the new or one's own culture based on the evidence of new cultural experiences and information. 4. Decentering, for example, when a learner realizes and accepts differences between the new and his or her own culture, or distances himself or herself from his or her own perspectives and beliefs. And lastly, reflexivity, which involves reflections on oneself or one's own culture and a reconstruction of one's own values, beliefs, and identity. This is a graphical representation of the complete taxonomy that resulted from the analysis of our data. I apologize that the taxonomy is too small to be read, Unfortunately, the final taxonomy diagram is so large that it hardly fits onto the screen. The various forms of mediation are, as I had explained, first classified under the direction of mediation, that is, for others or for self. Then they are further divided under the 9 larger headings you had seen on the previous slide. And under each of these headings, you will find a listing of the individual forms of mediations we identified in the data. Because the taxonomy on the previous slide was so small, let's take a close-up look at one section of it with selected examples. We will focus here on 3 groups of mediation classified under mediations for self. The first of the 3 groups, knowledge uptake acquisition, involves mediations through which learners notice new cultural practices or proactively seek information on the new culture. In the example provided here, Paul, who was in Japan for a study abroad, sought the advice of Japanese students supporting him and his classmates about the level of politeness in the language that is required when speaking with new acquaintances. The second group here consists of mediations that help learners construct meaning out of new cultural information and experiences. Among the mediations belonging to this group we call meaning making is that of connecting. An instance of connecting in the data was when Hong Mei in Seoul observed the Korean practice of eating with either only chopsticks or spoon, and never both together, with a practice in Singapore where people often combine the use of chopsticks with a spoon. The third group shown here is called decentering. Among the mediations in this group is accepting differences and different perspectives of other cultures, as exemplified by the case of Yan, who was in Paris and initially angry at being accused of shoplifting in France, but finally accepting that this was perhaps due to the French being more cautious because of the higher crime rates in big French cities, which is different from the situation he knows in Singapore. We also analyzed how the various forms of mediations we had identified are distributed and related, and we observe a trend in the concurrence and sequence of these mediations. Let's take a look at an episode involving Samantha, who was in Seoul for study abroad. She gained new knowledge about Korean parliamentarians who seemed to engage frequently in fights, and sought to inform herself further by asking her local student buddy, who explained that this was most likely an expression of the extreme passion. Both these instances of mediation, observing a new practice in the new culture and informing oneself about it, fall under the larger heading of knowledge uptake and acquisition in our taxonomy. This then triggered an attempt by her to interpret and understand the new information by relating it to what she knows about her own country, connecting and interpreting. These are mediations that fall under the heading of meaning making. Initially, it led to an unfavorable appraisal of the new culture, based on what she had observed and reasoned to be a not very civilized manner of political debate. This falls under the larger heading of critical appraisal. Eventually, however, she came to recognize that different cultures will have different practices, which must be viewed and judged from the respective cultural perspectives, achieving a certain degree of decentering. So the intercultural developmental process here seems to be triggered by knowledge uptake progresses to an attempt at meaning making, leading eventually to critical appraisal and decentering. Let's take a look at a second example. In this example, Nadia, who was in Freiburg in Germany, was assigned to a German host family, and her host mother spent some time in the first 2 days of a stay to inform her about recycling practices in her home to help her adapt to these practices. Besides this introduction, Nadia also made her own observations about trash separation. She sought to interpret these practices and to understand the rationale behind them by connecting them to practices in Singapore. She thus gained an understanding of recycling in Germany and its importance, eventually arriving at a positive appraisal. Subsequently, she did not only recycle during her stay in Germany, but also after the trip back in Singapore. She informed us in her interview that she became more conscious about recycling and wanted to make a greater effort to recycle, which suggests that she had, through her experiences in the new culture, assimilated some of its practices and reconstructed her own values and beliefs. Mediations, which fall under the larger heading of reflexivity in our taxonomy. Here, the sequence of intercultural mediations leads from knowledge uptake through meaning making, decentering, and critical appraisal to reflexivity. The concurrence and sequence of these mediations suggests that there is a typical progression in intercultural mediation, and most likely in the intercultural development of the learners as well. The analysis of the data led us to this schematic of how intercultural mediations would appear to contribute to intercultural development. The mediations making up the categories of knowledge uptake and acquisition and meaning making would appear to be typical trigger and transitional processes that help learners achieve, though not always necessarily doing so, the target mediations of decentering, critical appraisal, and reflexivity. Now, we call them target mediations because they are generally considered to be the skills, competencies, and awareness that we would associate with a higher level of intercultural competence. While in most of the episodes we analyze, reflexivity was apparently the last and highest step in the progression of mediations. It was unclear if critical appraisal would precede decentering or vice versa. There were instances where, having first decentered, the learners were in a better position to appraise the new culture from its perspective. But there were also instances where the attempt to appraise the new or one's own culture helped learners to understand the influence of their own cultural perspectives in making judgments, and thus to distance themselves from their own perspectives. We don't think that this really matters, as there cannot be a fixed pattern of progression that would apply without fail in all cases. Human experiences, social interactions, mental processes, and mediations are so complex and can differ in different contexts with different interlocutors that we must allow for and accept that there will be variations and different paths for different people and situations. In the process of intercultural development, the subjects may experience support and scaffolding from others, such as program administrators, instructors, student buddies, host families, or just the incidental passerby in the local community. This is represented by the right side of this diagram. They may also apply the newly developed mediation of skills in their interactions with members of the foreign culture. for example, to establish and manage the relationships with them. This will in turn further the development of the intercultural competence, as represented on the left side of this diagram. We would like to believe that the findings from our study bear much potential for curricular and instructional practices in intercultural language education. The taxonomies we have presented here can inform both planners and instructors in the development of curricular goals and progression and classroom practice. For instance, we would expect that lesson plans and materials at the initial stages would focus more on the trigger or lower order mediations before progressively upping the complexity to help learners achieve the target mediations of decentering, critical appraisal, and reflexivity. And the individual classes of mediations and the specific examples of such mediations could serve as a guide in planning actual lesson tasks and activities. We hope too that the findings would inform research and provide colleagues with a framework that would guide the research design as well as the analysis of intercultural mediation, and to identify specific instances of mediation and their purposes and possible effects on intercultural development. Now, to briefly summarize, by analyzing data collected from subjects participating in study abroad programs, our study has produced a comprehensive, though by no means exhaustive, taxonomy of intercultural mediations, as well as a hierarchical taxonomy of how the different forms of mediation at both the inter- and intrapersonal levels relate to each other and how they contribute to intercultural development. However, our findings are based solely on data from learners in a study abroad context. Perhaps future research could focus more on data from other settings, especially from the instructional context, involving both in and out of class situations. It would also be useful to collect data from external mediators in students' learning in order to capture the perspectives of the mediations they provide. Such data will allow us to expand and refine our findings and our proposed taxonomies of intercultural mediation. If you would like to know more about this project, or would like to access some of the materials such as the taxonomies we have generated, you are most welcome to contact me at the email address shown here. Thank you for your interest and for listening to this presentation. I look forward to discussing this further with you or to answer any questions you might have.